I'd been back at Willow Bend Farm for maybe 7 hours when a woman in a tan raincoat stood at the bottom of my porch steps and told me I had 10 minutes to get off my own property. She said it calmly too, like she was reminding me about a dentist appointment, not trying to throw a grown man off the land his family had owned since Truman was in the White House. The folder in my hand said the farm belonged to me now. Every last acre of it, but the 4 brand new rental cottages sitting at the edge of my late aunt's apple orchard said somebody had spent a whole lot of money betting I would never bother to read the fine print. My name is Ray Haskins, and this happened in the fall of 1998, up in Alder County, Michigan, where the roads turned to gravel after the last bait shop, and everybody knows everybody's business by Sunday afternoon, whether they want to or not. I was 47 then, recently divorced, recently unemployed after the furniture plant in Grand Rapids started cutting people loose, and I had just buried my Aunt Ruth, the woman who raised me for most of my teenage years after my mother passed. Ruth left me Willow Bend Farm, 44 acres of old apple trees, a weathered red barn, a little stretch of Lake Perch shoreline, and the kind of quiet you do not understand until you have spent 20 years away from it. I had not been there since the previous Christmas. I drove in just after lunch with a truck full of boxes, a thermos of bad gas station coffee, and one of those cheap road maps folded so many times it looked like it had been in a fight. The first thing I noticed was the mailbox. It had a new coat of white paint. That was strange because Ruth hated white paint. She used to say white paint was what people use when they wanted an old thing to lie about its age. The second thing I noticed was the road through the orchard. It had been widened, graveled, and marked with little wooden signs that said things like Lakeside Hideaway and Sunset Cabin. At first I thought I had missed a turn. Then I saw the porch lights glowing through the trees, one cottage after another, 4 neat little buildings with cedar shingles, window boxes, stone fire pits, and brass key boxes hanging beside their doors. There were fresh towels stacked in baskets, folding lawn chairs around each fire pit, and one of those hand-painted signs telling guests where to throw their trash. I stopped my truck so hard that a box of kitchen plates slid off the passenger seat and broke on the floorboard. I got out, walked down through the orchard, and stared at the closest cottage for a good minute before I said anything. The sign over the door read, "The Heron House." Underneath it, in small painted letters, it said, "Managed by Birch Hollow Shores Association." I remember looking around honestly thinking maybe I'd gone crazy. My aunt lived on a farm. There were no gates, no manicured neighborhood entrance, no clubhouse, no pool, no homeowners association. The closest thing we had to a community rule was that old Mr. Murad quote, "Darnell across the road would call the sheriff if your dog chased his chickens twice in 1 week." I walked back toward the house and found a laminated sign nailed to one of Ruth's maples. It said, "Private recreation area for Birch Hollow Shores residents and guests. Please respect community property." I ripped it down so hard I took a strip of bark with it, and I felt bad about that later because Ruth loved that tree, but at the time I was too angry to care. Inside the farmhouse, I went straight to the office behind the kitchen. Ruth kept all her important papers in an old green metal file cabinet, the kind with one drawer that always stuck unless you kicked it in the same spot. The deed was exactly where it should have been, inside a faded manila folder beside her tax records, and a stack of cancelled checks tied together with a rubber band. 44 acres. No easements, no leases, no shared access, no neighborhood agreement. Just the original description of the property, the same boundaries my grandfather had walked with a surveyor back in 1956. I was still holding that deed when I heard tires crunching up the driveway. A dark blue Buick stopped beside my truck, and a woman stepped out wearing a tan raincoat, low heels that had no business on a gravel road, and an expression that told me she had spent most of her adult life correcting people in grocery store parking lots. She walked right up to my porch without asking if she could, looked me over once and said, "You must be Ray Haskins." I said, "Depends who is asking." She smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. It was the kind you see on somebody who has already decided how a conversation is going to end. "My name is Janet Weller," she said. "I'm the president of Birch Hollow Shores Association. I need you to leave the premises until we can sort out this trespassing issue." I think for a second I honestly thought she was joking. I looked behind me at the house, then down at the deed in my hand, then back at her. I said, "Mom, this is my aunt's farm. She passed 2 weeks ago. This is my farm now." Janet took one step closer to the porch. "That is a very bold claim," she said, "considering you are standing on community land." I held up the deed. You mean the community land with my family's name on it? Her eyes dropped to the paper, and for the first time, her smile slipped just a little. Then she said, "This parcel was transferred into the Birch Hollow Recreation Tract 3 years ago. Your aunt signed the agreement herself." I said my aunt had a stroke 3 years ago. She could barely hold a spoon, much less sign away half a farm. Janet folded her arms. "The association has a legal survey, a zoning approval, construction permits, and a properly recorded boundary adjustment. You are welcome to retain counsel, Mr. Haskins, but until this matter is settled, I suggest you stop interfering with our rental properties." Rental properties? That was the phrase that finally made the whole thing settle in my chest. Those cottages were not some neighborhood picnic area. They were business. They were money. Somebody had built 4 vacation cabins on my aunt's orchard and had been collecting checks while she was too sick to fight them. I said, "Who exactly gave you permission to put cottages on my land?" Janet's face went flat. "Your aunt did." I said, "Then you will not mind if I call the county and ask them for a copy of her signature." Janet stared at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You do what you think you need to do. Just remember, people who come into a community and start making accusations usually find out they do not have as many friends as they thought." She turned around, got into that Buick, and sprayed gravel all over my front lawn on the way out. I stood there until the sound of her engine disappeared. Then I went inside and called the county planning office from Ruth's old kitchen phone. It had one of those long curly cords that always twisted around your wrist. A young man named Patrick Lyle answered. He sounded maybe 30, polite in the way county employees sound when they have already had 6 people yell at them before lunch. I explained what I had found. He pulled up the parcel number on his computer, and I could hear keys clicking while he looked. Then he said, "According to our map, sir, the cottages are inside the Birch Hollow Shores recreation boundary." I told him that was impossible. I read him the legal description from the deed, then gave him the old survey marker numbers from the back of the folder. There was a pause. Not a short pause either. The kind of pause that makes you stop breathing because you know the person on the other end has just found something they do not like. Finally, Patrick said, "Mr. Haskins, there was a boundary correction filed in October of 1995. It appears the South Orchard and the Lakeside Strip were reassigned as association common property." I said, "Who signed it?" More typing. Then he said, "Your aunt, Ruth Haskins, according to the form." I asked him to read the date again. October of 1995. I told him Ruth had been in St. Neoth, Mary's Hospital that month, recovering from the stroke that left her right hand curled against her chest. Patrick did not say anything for a second. Then he lowered his voice and said, "Sir, I think you should come down here in person." I drove to the county building the next morning before the sun had burned off the fog over the lake. The planning office was in the basement, across from the driver's license counter and a vending machine that smelled like hot pennies. Patrick met me with a stack of printouts and a face that looked more worried than it had sounded on the phone. He showed me the county map first. On the screen, the boundary of Birch Hollow Shores had a long hook-shaped piece that reached down through Ruth's orchard toward the lake. It looked wrong. Not just emotionally wrong, but visually wrong. The lines did not match the old survey. They cut across rows of trees that had been there for 40 years. Patrick brought up the scanned boundary adjustment. It had Ruth's name in looping blue ink at the bottom and a notary seal stamped beside it. I knew that signature was fake before I finished looking at it. Ruth signed her name with a short R, a sharp H, and one long flourish under the whole thing. This signature looked like somebody had copied it from memory after seeing it once on a birthday card. I asked Patrick who notarized it. He checked the file and said the name was Brenda Weller. I looked up at him. Any relation to Janet Weller?" Patrick swallowed. "I cannot say for sure," he said, "but I can tell you Brenda Weller's notary registration is in the file." It took him less than a minute to pull it up. Same mailing address as Janet Weller. Same small subdivision just beyond the edge of the farm. I had that strange feeling people get when the truth arrives too fast. It is not relief. It is not even anger at first. It is just the body realizing you were right to be afraid. I got certified copies of everything and drove straight to the sheriff's department. Deputy Chief Terry Sloan was a heavy-set man with silver hair, a coffee stain on his tie, and the sort of tired eyes you see on someone who has spent 20 years listening to neighbors accuse each other of crimes over fence lines. He listened while I told him the whole thing. He looked at the deed, the boundary adjustment, the hospital dates, the notary name, and finally, the cottage permits. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Mr. Haskins, I have seen people fight over 6 inches of driveway for 10 years. This is not that. If the signature is forged, and if somebody used it to take property and make money, then we are talking about a lot more than a civil dispute." I said, "What do you need from me?" He told me he needed proof Ruth could not have signed the document, proof the cottages were producing income, and a way to connect Janet Weller personally to the whole operation. I had the first piece already. Ruth's medical records were in a box upstairs at the farmhouse because she never threw anything out, not even the hospital menu from the week she had the stroke. For the money part, I called Janice Hall, an old friend from high school who had become a real estate attorney in Lansing. Janice had always been smarter than me, which I knew because she had once talked me out of buying a boat I could not afford, a decision I held against her for years until I realized she was right. I told her what had happened. She did not laugh, did not say it sounded unbelievable, did not waste time telling me to calm down. She said, "Fax me the deed, the survey, the permit numbers, and every piece of paper with Janet Weller's name on it." I said, "I do not own a fax machine." Janice said, "Then go to the copy store in town and use theirs. This is 1998, Ray, not the Stone Age." That afternoon I went back to the cottages. I wanted photographs, notes, dates, anything that showed those buildings were active. The first cabin was unlocked. Inside there were clean sheets, brochures for boat rentals, an old television with a VCR underneath it, and a guest book filled with names from Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, even one couple from Toronto. There was a chalkboard by the kitchen that said check in after 3 p.m. Please call the office before using the dock. I walked through each room taking pictures with a disposable Kodak camera, the kind where you had no idea whether any picture came out until you paid to get the roll developed. I wrote down the serial numbers on the electric meters. I copied the reservation calendar hanging in the office shed. It was all there in black pen. Weekend bookings, deposits received, the numbers. 4 cottages were bringing people in every week from May through October. I was standing beside the 4th cottage when a golf cart came buzzing up the gravel path. A man in a windbreaker and a Detroit Tigers cap jumped out carrying a clipboard. He was maybe 50, skinny as a fence post, with the look of a man who had spent too long doing whatever somebody else told him to do. He said, "You cannot be back here. We have guests checking in this afternoon." I said, "Who are you?" He said his name was Clyde Henson, property manager. I asked him who hired him. He said, "Birch Hollow. Janet Weller." I pointed at the ground. "You ever meet the person who owns this land?" Clyde looked confused. "Janet owns it," he said. "No," I said. "Janet owns it," he said. "No," I said. "Janet owns a lie. She has been renting by the weekend." I held up the deed, then showed him the certified boundary papers. His mouth opened a little, then closed again. I told him the sheriff was investigating the signature, the permits, and the rental operation. He said he did not know anything about it. I believed him. People like Janet Weller usually do not tell the guy changing sheets that he is working for a fraud ring. I said, "Clyde, you need to stop taking reservations until you talk to an attorney. And tell Janet if she sends another guest onto this property, I will make sure the sheriff knows exactly who she put at risk." He stood there a moment, staring at the cottages like he had never really seen them before. Then he got back in the golf cart and drove away, much slower than he had arrived. That night I sat at Ruth's kitchen table with every light on in the house, going through boxes she had kept in the pantry. I found old property tax receipts, letters from the Orchard Cooperative, invoices for fertilizer, and eventually a small spiral notebook with her handwriting on the cover. The first few pages were grocery lists and reminders for church bake sales. Then I found a page dated July 1995. It said, "Janet came again. Says, Birch Hollow needs lake access. Says I am being selfish. Told her the lake is not for sale." Under that, on a different day, Ruth had written, "They want the South Orchard because it is the easiest walk to the water." I told them no. There was one more note, written just a few weeks before her stroke. It said, "If anything happens to me, Ray needs to check the fence line." I sat there with that notebook in my hands until the coffee got cold. My aunt had known they were coming after the land. Maybe she did not know how far Janet would go, but she knew enough to leave me a warning. And that was when this stopped being about a few cottages. It became about a woman who had watched Ruth get sick, watched her lose the strength to defend herself, then stepped in with a forged signature and built a business on top of her silence. Part 2. Janice called me 2 days later, and I could tell from the way she said my name that she had found something ugly. She said, "Ray, the cottages are not technically owned by Birch Hollow Shores Association. They are owned by a company called North Water Retreats, LLC. I asked who owned that. A company called North Water Retreats, LLC. I asked who owned that. She said, yes. I did not need to. Janet Weller. Janice had searched state business records, county tax records, and bank filings connected to the construction permits. North Water Retreats had been created 4 months after the boundary adjustment was filed. The registered office was a rented mailbox at a shipping store in town. The listed manager was Janet Weller. The cottage permits had been submitted through the association, but the rental income was going through Janet's private company. She had used the neighborhood to get the permits and used my aunt's land to build the cottages. Then she had pulled the money out through a separate business so it would not show up in the association books. I said, "How much money are we talking about?" Janice was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "At least $90,000 over 2 full rental seasons, maybe more." In 1998, $90,000 was not just a nice little side business. It was a house, a college fund, a chance to buy a person like Janet Weller enough influence to keep everyone around her afraid. Janice also found something else. Payments for the cottages had come from the Birch Hollow Reserve account. HOA dues, money from ordinary people who thought they were paying for snow plowing, streetlights, and the little entrance sign with the flower bed under it. Janet had taken their money, built cottages on land she did not own, then used the lake view to make herself rich. Deputy Chief Sloan moved quickly once Janice turned over the records. The county building inspector came out with 2 deputies and Patrick from planning. They walked the cottages, checked the permits, photographed the utility hookups, and posted red stop work notices on every door. I stood off to the side with my folder under one arm and Ruth's notebook under the other. It was a cold morning, wind coming off the lake, leaves skittering across the gravel like little brown mice. Janice arrived about 20 minutes later, this time in a red coat and no smile at all. She stepped out of her Buick and marched toward the closest deputy. "You cannot shut these cottages down," she said. "We have paying guests." The deputy held up one hand. "Mom, you need to stay back. This is an active investigation." Janet looked at me, and I saw something in her face I had not seen before. Fear. Not much, just enough to make her angry. She said, "You think you won because you waved an old deed around. You do not understand what this community needs." I said, "I understand exactly what you need. You needed lake access, you needed a cash machine, and you needed an old sick woman who could not fight back." Janet stepped closer, and the deputy moved between us. She said, "Your aunt was stubborn. She was sitting on land that could have helped hundreds of families." I laughed once and it came out colder than I meant it to. I said, "You built 4 cottages for vacationers from Chicago. Do not pretend you were feeding the poor." For a second, nobody spoke, and the deputy told Janet to leave the property. She did, but she looked back at me before getting in her car. It was the look of someone who had spent years being obeyed and had just discovered that obedience can run out. The stop work orders did not end the fight. They just made Janet desperate. 3 days later, a lawyer in a grey suit came to the farmhouse with a manila envelope and a smile that reminded me of a funeral director trying to sell flowers. He said he represented Birch Hollow Shores and that the association intended to file the quiet title action. They were claiming historical use of the South Orchard, shared lake access, and a long-standing agreement with Ruth. I said, "Historical use? You mean the cottages you built 3 years ago with a forged signature?" He said, "I would advise you not to make accusations you cannot prove." I stepped down off the porch and got close enough that he could smell the wood smoke on my jacket. I said, "Counselor, I have hospital records, a fake notary stamp, a dead woman's property line on a county map, and a deputy chief who is getting tired of your client's nonsense. You can file whatever paper makes you feel useful, but do not come back here pretending a stolen orchard is an easement." He hesitated, then held out the envelope. I did not take it. I told him if the court wanted to speak to me, the court could serve me itself. He left the envelope on the porch rail and walked away. I watched him drive down the road, then I picked up the envelope with a pair of fireplace tongs and dropped it into the kitchen trash. Janice said later that was dramatic. I told her it was not dramatic. It was recycling. The real break came from Patrick Lyle. He came to the farmhouse one evening after work, carrying a cardboard tube full of old maps. He looked nervous when he came in, and I could see why. In a small county office, exposing somebody can make your work life miserable. Patrick spread the maps across Ruth's dining room table, pushing aside a bowl of apples that had been sitting there since the funeral. He showed me the original county plat first, yellowed at the edges with Ruth's 44 acres drawn in one clean shape. Then he showed me the version in the county computer system. The Birch Hollow boundary had been stretched over the orchard in a crooked arc, almost like somebody had taken a marker and dragged it where they wanted it to go. Patrick said this change was entered into the mapping system at 1:17 in the morning on a Saturday. I said, "Who has access to the system at 1 in the morning?" He looked at the map and said, "2 people. Me and the former county mapping contractor, Clay Bolton." I asked if he was accusing Clay. Patrick shook his head. "I am saying the edit was made using his login. I do not know whether he did it or somebody used his password, but this part is important." Patrick tapped the map with one finger. The change was never recorded in the official plat book. It exists in the computer, but not where it has to exist for it to be legally binding. I looked at that fake boundary line and felt something loosen inside me. All Janet had built her little empire on was ink, fear, and the hope that nobody would check. The cottages, the rental money, the permit applications, the attitude, all of it stood on a line that had never truly existed. News traveled through Birch Hollow faster than any legal process. There was no social media back then, no online outrage, no videos going around the country in an hour. We had a local paper, a diner counter, the church bulletin, and a radio host named Floyd who could turn a pothole complaint into a 3-day scandal. By the end of that week, people were talking. The first neighbors to come by were Don and Marianne Reeves, a retired couple who lived in the subdivision. They brought a peach pie wrapped in foil and stood awkwardly on my porch like kids sent to apologize to a teacher. Marianne said, "We did not know Mr. Haskins. Janet told us the cottages were a community project. She said the money would pay for road repairs and security." Don said she raised our dues twice. Said it was for landscaping and lake maintenance. We do not even have a lake inside the neighborhood. I asked if they had records. Don looked almost offended. He said, "Son, I worked at the Ford plant for 34 years. I keep every statement I have ever received. They brought me newsletters, meeting minutes, payment stubs, and copies of letters Janet had sent when people questioned the dues. One letter said that residents who fail to support neighborhood unity might lose access to shared facilities. They did not even have shared facilities. They had one sad picnic table beside a mailbox cluster and a patch of grass that everybody called the common area because nobody wanted to mow it. More people came over the next few days. Some were apologetic, some were angry. Some had been scared of Janet for so long they had forgotten they were allowed to speak plainly. A man named Harold Van, a retired mechanic with hands like shovel blades, brought me a letter Janet had sent him after he refused to vote for a dues increase. The letter threatened to review his voting rights. Harold sat at Ruth's kitchen table, drank coffee from one of her old chipped mugs and said, "That woman fined me $50 because my grandson parked his pickup in my driveway for 3 nights. Then she used our money to build herself a lake resort." I said, "You ever tell anybody?" Harold stared down at the letter. He said, "Folks like her count on people being tired. They do not have to beat you. They just have to make you feel like fighting is more trouble than it is worth." That stayed with me. I had been tired myself. Tired from the divorce, tired from losing my job, tired from burying the last person who remembered me as a scared, skinny kid with holes in his shoes. Janet had probably looked at me and seen a man who would take a settlement, sell the farm, and disappear. She had no idea Aunt Ruth had taught me one thing better than anything else. Never let somebody rush you off a piece of ground they are afraid you might stand on. Janice filed a civil suit asking for the property line to be restored, the cottages to be removed, the rental income to be returned, and the association accounts to be frozen until the county finished its investigation. The judge approved the freeze the next morning. That was when the trouble got personal. First, somebody smashed my mailbox with a baseball bat. Then the phone line to the house was cut one night, right near the old fence post by the road. I found the wire hanging loose in the grass the next morning, and I knew it had not happened by accident. On the third night, I heard my dog barking near the orchard around 1 in the morning. Ruth's old dog, Bessie, had died years before, but I had adopted a mutt from the shelter after the divorce, a brindle-colored thing named Copper, who was not smart enough to stay out of trouble, but smart enough to know when trouble was nearby. I looked out the window and saw 2 figures near the cottages. One had a flashlight covered with something red, maybe cloth, maybe tape. The other was carrying a plastic gas can. I did not go charging outside like a hero in a bad movie. I called the sheriff from the neighbor's house because my line was still dead. Then I turned on every porch light, got Copper inside, and stood where they could see me. The 2 figures disappeared into the trees before the deputies arrived, but the trail camera Patrick had loaned me caught enough to show there had been people there. The deputies took the tape, set up patrols on the road, and told me not to stay alone if I could help it. I called Janice, and she drove up from Lansing the next day with a suitcase, 2 legal pads, and enough irritation to power a small town. She stood in the orchard looking at the cottages and said, "You know, Ray, I have handled divorces uglier than this, but I've never had a client whose opposing party built a vacation business on his property and then tried to burn down the evidence." I said, "Maybe you need more interesting clients." She said, "I have known you since 10th grade. You have never once made my life more interesting in a good way." Around that same time, Brenda Weller's notary commission was suspended. The state examiner found that the stamp on Ruth's boundary adjustment had been expired for almost a year when the document was supposedly signed. The handwriting analyst hired by the sheriff compared the signature with dozens of Ruth's checks, church letters, and property tax documents. His report was not dramatic. It did not need to be. It said the signature on the boundary adjustment was not written by Ruth Haskins. It said the pen pressure did not match, the letter formations did not match, and the signature was likely copied by another person. Janet's lawyer withdrew from the case the day after that report came in. He filed a short notice saying he could no longer represent her because she was not providing requested documents. Janice read it at the kitchen table and said, "That is attorney language, for she lied to me too." I said, "Well, at least she is consistent." 2 days later, Janet Weller was arrested at the Birch Hollow Monthly Association meeting. I was not there at first. I heard about it from Harold. He called the farmhouse and said, "You might want to get down here." I drove to the community hall, a beige little building beside the county road with folding chairs, a coffee urn, and a framed photo of the subdivision entrance hanging on the wall like it was the Grand Canyon. By the time I arrived, 2 sheriff's cruisers were parked out front. Through the window, I could see Janet standing near the front table, still wearing one of her neat suits, still holding a stack of meeting papers like she thought paperwork could protect her. Deputy Chief Sloan stood beside her while another deputy read the charges: forgery, fraudulent conveyance, misappropriation of association funds, identity fraud involving a deceased contractor. That last part surprised everybody. Janice had found payments from North Water Retreats to a construction company that did not exist anymore. The tax number belonged to a contractor named Lester Pike, who had died 4 years earlier. Janet had used his old business identity to hide payments for the cottage construction. She had not just taken a little shortcut. She had built an entire web of false names around herself. Janet saw me standing in the back of the room. For a second, all the noise stopped. She looked at me with a face I will never forget, not because it was angry, but because it was empty. The confidence was gone. The charm was gone. There was just a woman who had believed she could control a whole community forever. Realizing the room had turned against her, she said, "This is political." Somebody in the crowd laughed. Not a cruel laugh, exactly. More like the sound people make when a storm finally breaks after weeks of heavy air. The deputies put cuffs on her and walked her outside. Nobody cheered at first. Then somebody clapped once. Then Harold clapped. Then Marianne Reeves stood up and clapped too. After that, the whole room joined in. I did not clap. I just stood there, holding Ruth's old notebook in my jacket pocket, and watched Janet get into the cruiser. I did not feel happy. I felt tired, but it was a different kind of tired than before. It was the tired you feel after carrying something heavy uphill and finally setting it down. Part 3. The arrest was not the end of it. In some ways, it was the first time the whole mess became visible enough for people to understand how deep it went. The Alder County Gazette ran a front-page story the following Thursday. It had a picture of the cottages, a picture of Janet walking out of the community hall, and a headline that said, "HOA President Charged in Lakefront Property Scheme." Floyd talked about it on his morning radio show for 3 straight days. Callers argued over whether the homeowners should have known, whether Janet had acted alone, whether the county had failed Ruth, whether I should sue every single person in Birch Hollow until they sold their cars and lawn furniture. I stopped listening after the second day. People love a story when it is happening to someone else. They love to sit in a warm truck or a diner booth and decide what another person should have done with their pain. The county held a public hearing 3 weeks later. It was in the old courthouse, the kind with cracked marble steps, wood paneling, and lights that hummed louder than they needed to. Janice sat beside me in the second row wearing a dark blue suit. I wore my best flannel shirt because I did not own a suit that still fit. Patrick stood near the front with a stack of maps. Deputy Chief Sloan was there too, along with the county commissioner, a state investigator, and half the people from Birch Hollow who suddenly remembered they had opinions about property law. The hearing started with Patrick showing the original plat and the altered computer map on an overhead projector. In 1998, that meant clear plastic sheets, a humming machine, and the big white screen that made everybody look yellow on the fluorescent lights. He explained that the fake boundary adjustment had been entered into the county system using Clay Bolton's old contractor account. Clay had retired from county work 2 years before the edit showed up. The login was supposed to have been disabled. It was not. The official deed records had never been changed. The official plat book had never been changed. Only the county computer map had been changed, just enough to make permit applications go through if nobody checked the original documents. Then the handwriting analyst testified. He did not say much. He did not have to. He showed enlarged copies of Ruth's real signature beside the forged one. The difference was obvious even to people who had never looked at handwriting in their lives. The county commissioner turned toward me and said, "Mr. Haskins, would you like to address the board?" I stood up and walked to the podium with my hands shaking more than I wanted them to. I looked out at the crowd, at people who had once believed Janet, people who had paid her dues, people who had let her find their neighbors and speak for them. I said, "I did not come here looking for a fight. I came back to bury my aunt and fix a few things around a farm. Instead, I found out someone had taken advantage of a sick woman, changed a line on a map, and made money off land that was never theirs." I said, "I want the record corrected, but I also want somebody to explain how a person can walk into a county office with a lie and walk out with enough paper to build 4 houses on somebody else's property." The room got quiet. Then I said, "My aunt was not just a signature at the bottom of a form. She was a person. She grew those trees. She paid taxes on that land for decades. She sat by that lake when she was lonely. She had a right to be treated like she existed." The commissioner nodded, and the board voted that afternoon to delete the false boundary from the county mapping system and refer the case to the state attorney general's office for investigation into record tampering. A week later, Clay Bolton was arrested. The state investigators found that Northwater Retreats had been sending monthly checks to him under the name of consulting fees. No consulting reports, no invoices, no work orders, just money. He had taken almost $40,000 over 2 years in exchange for keeping the fake boundary alive in the county system. Janet had not acted alone after all. She had bought herself access to the map, and Clay had sold her the illusion that a computer screen could erase a family history. Around that time, Birch Hollow's residents came to a decision of their own. They called a special meeting and asked me to attend. I almost said no. I had no interest in sitting in another room while people explained how sorry they were after the sheriff got involved. But Harold called and said, "Come anyway. You should hear this from the people who finally grew a spine." So I went. The community hall looked different that night. No Janet at the front table, no stack of violation notices, no nervous people staring at the floor. A woman named Elaine Porter stood up and said she had been chosen interim president. She had worked as a school secretary for 20 years, and she had the kind of voice that could make a room listen without raising itself once. She said they had found a second copy of the Birch Hollow bylaws. It was an older version, filed in a drawer at the bank. The version Janet had been using gave herself the power to move reserve funds without a vote. That clause had been added after she became president, but it had never been approved by the homeowners. Several proxy votes appeared to belong to people who had moved away, and 2 belonged to people who had died. Elaine looked at me and said, "We are dissolving the association. We have enough signatures. We are hiring an outside accountant. We are selling the little common parcel by the entrance to cover the audit, and we are asking the court to make sure Janet cannot come near the finances again. I remember sitting there with my arms crossed, thinking about all the times Ruth had probably sat at home while people like Janet told her what was best for her land. I said, "What do you want from me?" Elaine said, "Nothing. We just wanted you to know that we are not going to pretend this was one bad apple and move on. We let her have too much power. Some of us were scared, some of us were lazy. Some of us liked it when she went after people we did not like. That is on us too." It was the most honest thing I had heard since this whole thing started. Then Harold stood up with a coffee can in his hand. He said, "Folks have been putting money in here for Ray's legal bills." I shook my head right away. I said, "No. Keep it. Use it to fix your own neighborhood. Put streetlights up. Repair your roads. Stop letting one person decide who gets to belong." Harold looked like he wanted to argue, but then he smiled. He said, "Your aunt would have liked you." I said, "She would have told me not to get sentimental in public." 2 weeks later, the cottages came down. There was a court order for their removal, and by then most of the materials had already been stripped out for evidence and insurance claims. The county sent excavators. A demolition crew came from 2 towns over. A few Birch Hollow residents showed up with work gloves and pickup trucks, even though nobody had asked them to. Harold brought a pry bar, Don Reeves brought a chainsaw, Marianne brought sandwiches wrapped in wax paper for anyone who looked like they might faint from pride before lunch. I stood near the old orchard fence and watched the first cottage come down. The Heron house had been the prettiest one, which somehow made it worse. It folded in on itself, under the machine's arm, cedar siding breaking loose, windows cracking, the little painted sign tumbling into the dirt. I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I thought about Ruth sitting in her kitchen, writing that little warning in her notebook, knowing somebody wanted the orchard and maybe feeling too sick to stop them. I thought about how easy it would have been for me to sell everything, take whatever settlement I could get, and go back to a smaller life somewhere else. But I had stayed. I had read the deed. I had asked questions. Sometimes that is all courage is, really, not some grand speech. Just staying in the room after somebody tells you it would be easier to leave. When the last cottage was gone, the south orchard looked raw and torn up. There were tire tracks, broken stones, scattered nails, and patches of bare earth where the grass had been crushed. The lake was visible again through the trees. I stood there near sunset, and for the first time in years the property looked like itself. Not perfect, not healed, but honest. Janice came up beside me carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from town. She handed me one and said, "You know, you could still go after every homeowner individually. The judge would not blame you." I looked toward the subdivision, where porch lights were coming on one by one beyond the trees. I said, "They did not forge Ruth's name. They did not steal from her." She said, "Some of them looked away." I said, "Yes. And now they have to live with that. I have to live with what I do next." Janice did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "That is either very noble or very stubborn." I said, "My aunt raised me. It can be both." The county eventually offered me a settlement for the failure in its mapping system. It was not enough to make anybody rich, but it covered my legal bills, the orchard cleanup, new survey work, and the repairs to the house. I accepted it because Janice made me promise I would stop acting like suffering made me morally superior. She said, "Ray, you can forgive people and still cash a check." She was right, which was annoying. Before winter came, I hired a surveyor to reset every boundary marker around Willow Bend Farm. Steel stakes, concrete posts, GPS coordinates, photographs, everything documented twice. I put a new gate at the South Road, not because I wanted to shut the world out, but because I wanted the world to understand that a boundary is not an insult, it is a promise. It tells people where they stop and where you begin. I kept one thing from the cottages, not the signs, not the keys, not the rental records. I kept a small brass number from the door of the Heron house. It had the number 1 stamped into it. I put it in Ruth's desk drawer beside her notebook and the original deed. Some people would probably say I should have thrown it away. Maybe they're right, but I kept it because I never wanted to forget how close I came to losing the farm, just because somebody believed an old woman would be too weak to defend it and a tired man would be too broken to care. A few months later, I got a letter from Birch Hollow. It was signed by 32 homeowners. They apologized again, this time without lawyers, without excuses, without trying to make themselves sound better than they were. They said they were rebuilding the neighborhood without an association, one decision at a time. I did not write back right away. I left the letter on the kitchen table for 3 days, then finally folded it and put it in the drawer with the deed. I did not know whether forgiveness was something you gave all at once or something you practiced like a habit. I still do not know. What I know is this. People talk about land like it is just dirt and measurements, but land remembers. It remembers who planted on it, who bled on it, who tried to take it, and who stood still when it would have been easier to run. Willow Bend Farm is quiet again now. The cottages are gone. The orchard is growing back. Copper's old and grey around the muzzle, but he still barks at every car that comes down the road like he owns the place. Maybe he does. Some nights I sit on the porch with the lake in front of me and Ruth's old notebook in my lap, and I think about Janet Weller sitting somewhere, realizing that all the power she built came from people being too tired to question her, and I think about how close she came to getting away with it. So tell me this, what would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have sued every homeowner who stood by and let it happen? Would you have sold the land and walked away? Or would you have done what I did, drawn the line, held your ground, and tried to leave enough room for the people who were fooled to become better than they were before? Put your answer in the comments, because I still cannot decide whether justice means making people pay or making sure they never get the chance to do it again.